Hi, this is going to be another video in my continuing series of comparing the Beatle albums, at least the early Beatle albums, the stereo to the mono version. And today I'm going to be talking about the United Artists American soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night. And if you were around in 1964, the A Hard Day's Night soundtrack consisted of the songs that were actually a part of the movie, and then there were some George Martin instrumentals that were thrown in. The rest of the A Hard Day's Night tracks were kind of scattered through the rest of the American releases. Some of them fell on the Something New album. There were a couple that landed on Beatles 65. There was one track that landed on the previous American album, which was Beatles' second album. So they were kind of all scattered to the wind. Today we are just going to be talking about the soundtrack album. This was released on United Artists Records because they had the license to the film music, and it wasn't until the 1980s that Capitol reacquired the rights to the soundtrack. So I'm going to go through and show you what I have in terms of the A Hard Day's Night soundtrack. I'm going to start off with the mono version here that I just showed you moments ago. And this is what the United Artists label looked like. And as for the cover itself, if I had to pick between the two covers, the British version and the American version, the way that I'm feeling today anyway, I would probably go with the American version just because there's something that I really like about this, just showing them kind of from the nose level up. I just like the starkness of it, and I like both covers, but there's just something that I like about this one. This was a cover that I grew up with, so I don't know if it's nostalgia kicking in. This is the stereo copy that I have, and really the only difference is that it's got the little stereo band there at the top, whereas the mono, it does not. The mono also has United Artists there at the bottom. And also there is United Artists at the top on the stereo version, and on the mono version, United Artists is there at the bottom. That's really the only difference. The labels also look the same. I believe in the 70s, these albums were released on a tan United Artists label, so you might see copies of those floating around also. And then this copy that I have, this is after Capitol acquired the rights. You can see the Capitol insignia right there. Or the Capitol logo, I should say. And then this is the purple Capitol label. Again, if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that these purple Capitol label pressings are not great sound quality. If that's the only copy you have, so be it, but I wouldn't be searching them out by any means. I would try to get a copy of one of the early pressings, either the mono or the stereo versions. And so I have the only copy of A Hard Day's Night that is commercially available on CD, and it's part of this box set, which is the US albums. And it's also sold as a standalone CD. You can find it that way. And it does replicate the United Artists label on the CD cover, and the CD itself, the jacket, if you want to call it, is a replica of the original stereo album. This does contain both the stereo and the mono mixes. So down to the actual songs. Now, I did a review on the UK British release of A Hard Day's Night, which has both the soundtrack songs and the B-side of the album, which has the non-soundtrack tracks. And so, by and large, for the most part, the mixes are pretty similar, but I'm going to go through each of the stereo and the mono tracks and give you what I think. I'm also going to talk about the instrumental tracks as well. They're on here, so we might as well talk about them. I know, other than the fact that they're Beatle compositions, they really have nothing to do with the Beatles, but I'll go ahead and we will talk about them anyway. So for the song A Hard Day's Night, stereo is definitely the version I prefer. They're very closely they sound real close if you were to compare them side by side, listen to one and then listen to the other. The only difference that I can ascertain is that in stereo, it's a little bit louder, everything seems a little more beefed up, so I definitely prefer the stereo mix if I had to choose between the two. The next song is Tell Me Why. So these songs are also sequenced differently than they are on the original UK pressing, which is a little weird to hear them this way, and they do seem out of order. But again, this is the way that I grew up listening to the album, so it doesn't sound quite as unusual to me unless you spent the 90s and 2000s listening to the British CD like I did, in which case you kind of get acclimated to the British track listing. So nonetheless, Tell Me Why is track number 2 on side 1. In stereo, the piano is clear and the bass is louder. However, in mono, the vocals are much clearer, and to me, it just seems a cleaner mix. It's a more enjoyable mix to listen to. The vocals don't seem as loud, and the double tracking isn't quite as noticeable on the mono mix. So that's the one that I'm going to go with. I'll Cry Instead is the third track, and how this differs from the track that you will find on the British album is that there's an extra verse. The first verse is repeated at the very end of the song, and you're not going to hear that on the British album. This is only part of the American soundtrack. This mix is exclusive to the United Artists American A Hard Day's Night mix. And everything in the mono to me sounds very weak and one-dimensional. If you compare them side by side, there's really no contest. In stereo, everything is clear, the guitar is out in front, the tambourine is also mixed very high and stands out in the track, but just overall, I find the stereo mix is much more clearer, fuller, the bass is fuller on that track. So that's the one that I'm going to go with on that. And then we come to the very first instrumental track, which is I Should Have Known Better. Yes, I did listen to this track both in stereo and in mono. And yes, in stereo, although most people are going to skip over this track, but if you're interested, stereo version is much better. Everything is clear. It still sounds like elevator music. It still sounds cheesy. It's definitely of its time. But in terms of the sound quality, the phonics of everything, definitely the stereo mix is the one that I would prefer. Then we come to Happy Just to Dance With You. In mono, it's a good mix. You can clearly hear the guitar strumming, which is something that's a little harder to catch or at least pick up in the stereo version. In stereo, George's voice, and this is just to my ear, but it almost sounds like it's in a different key. I'm sure it's the same vocal take, at least I think it is, but to my ears in stereo, for some reason, it sounded like he was singing in a little bit of a higher key. The bass and the drums are louder in stereo. The backing vocals, however, are not as loud, and they almost sound buried in the stereo mix. So I'm going to go with mono for I'm Happy Just to Dance With You. I just found the mono mix was the one that I preferred and that I enjoyed listening to more. And then the last track on the first side of the American album is And I Love Her instrumental. A snoozer, definitely one that I skip over every single time. It's just so slow. I mean, it really puts you to sleep. There's just the do 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 guitar and then do 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 do. So I'm not a fan of it. Definitely the instrumental that I like the least on the American soundtrack album. So let's move over to side 2. Song 1 on the side 2 is I Should Have Known Better proper. One thing that I noticed is that the double tracking is way more pronounced in stereo. You can definitely hear the double tracking almost to the point where it's a little bit distracting. I noticed that the harmonica is louder and clearer in stereo also. The acoustic guitar sounds louder, and you can really hear the guitar being strummed really well. So I'm going to go with the stereo version. The mono, it just didn't really do anything for me. It sounded kind of flat, a little bit one-dimensional. And I'm nitpicking here because both mixes are great. I'm not knocking either one. It's not like some of the other Capitol mono tracks where they're just kind of a fold down of the stereo mix. I really, again, it's nitpicking, but I really feel like some of these differences are minor to say the least. But again, I'm going to go with the stereo version as the one that I prefer. If I fell, so just like in the other video that I did on A Hard Day's Night, there's a couple differences that you're going to note. Number one, in mono, John's voice on the intro is single tracked, and in stereo, his voice is double tracked. And in the lyric, the second lyric where Paul sings, "If our new love was in vain," in mono, his voice strains on the word vain, but in stereo, it drops out before he gets to the word vain, so you don't hear him kind of straining. Same as the British version, the stereo track is the one that I prefer. Nothing wrong with mono, particularly if you like hearing John's voice in isolation on the intro. But I just found stereo, you could hear the backing vocals clear, the harmonies were clear, the bass is clear, the acoustic guitar, just everything is brighter and clearer in stereo. And that's the one that I'm going to go with there. And I Love Her. In the mono version, and I noticed this more in the American album than I did the British version, and this is Paul's vocal in mono is way out front. Now it's single tracked, where in the stereo version it's double tracked, and the entire way through the song in mono, Paul's voice just stands out. You can hear it very clearly. It's single track, so there's not any of that competing with the double tracked vocal there. You can hear it very clear. The vocal itself is more enjoyable to listen to in mono, but overall I find that in stereo the song just it affected me more. I enjoyed it more in stereo. Just everything sounded, again, a little more vibrant, a little more colorful. The instruments, except for the block tapping, are not clear in mono. The only thing that you hear in the mono are Paul's voice and kind of the block tapping, where in stereo there's more, the other instruments are at a better volume. They're much brighter and clearer and more upfront in the mix. So next we get to another instrumental track, and that is Ringo's theme, This Boy. Now if you've seen the Hard Day's Night movie, this is sort of Ringo's moment to shine in the movie, where he's kind of, walking along the docks, and he's just kind of, he's on his little adventure, as it were. And so it's hard for me to separate this track from the, what I remember from the movie. And I guess maybe that's why I don't hate this instrumental as much. It conjures up images of, Ringo on his little day trip that he takes in the movie. So I don't mind this one so much. As with all the instrumental tracks, the stereo the mix is just louder and a little bit clearer. Not a whole lot of difference between the mono and the stereo, but with all these instrumentals, I'm going to go with the stereo version. Can't Buy Me Love is the next track. Definitely prefer that in stereo. It's much bouncier, it swings better, it's just more vibrant, punchier. The beat drives the music a lot better than it does in the mono version. Mono version's fine, but just in stereo, it just, I don't know, I find it's a lot more enjoyable to listen to, and it really rocks. And the last track is A Hard Day's Night, and probably of all the instrumental tracks, this is the one that I mind the least. It's kind of jazzy, almost in a West Coast jazzy kind of way. It's a nice way to close out the movie. Well, not really so much the movie. I mean, this appears in the movie right as the Beatles are converging back on the studio after they've been out looking for Ringo and, getting into a chase with the police and everything like that. But it's kind of a nice way to kind of wind down before the Beatles concert sequence in the movie. And I find it's a nice way to wind down the album. And there's something, I didn't live in the 60s, but there's just something very 60s about tracks like this that I enjoy. And, I just imagine listening to this, and a lot of music I imagine that wasn't rock and roll and, was soundtrack music or otherwise sounded like this. So I don't mind this track so much. I enjoy it for its, like again, it's jazzy quality. But so that ends the album. Which version do I prefer overall, mono or stereo? I'm going to go with the stereo version. Again, nothing wrong with the mono version, but just stereo was just more vibrant, louder. The instruments in back are clear. If you want to concentrate more on the vocals, I would listen to the mono. That would be the version that you'd want to listen to, because there's definitely more separation with the vocals to the exclusion of some of the backing tracks. So that is my verdict on the A Hard Day's Night soundtrack. The next album that I'm going to be doing is Beatles for Sale. I appreciate your comments. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care and have a great day.